The recent history of Mexico is often viewed as one of narcotics, of civil wars, and endemic corruption. Unfortunately, Mexico's history during the Cold War was also heavily marked by these things. For 14 years, Mexico found itself fighting a brutal insurgency composed of left-wing and student movements, with few holds barred in how the fight was carried out. From the use of torture to people simply disappearing forever, actions carried out against the Mexican people were appalling, with little accountability even to the present day. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at the often overlooked conflict of Mexico's dirty war. This is the Cold War. Life is busy for all of us. There's always something waiting, something pressing, but there's always time to learn something new, which is why I am so thrilled to be working with the sponsor of today's video, a rising star in the streaming world, Magellan TV. Not only is Magellan TV the highest rated documentary streaming app on Google Play, but it offers the best value of any premium documentary streaming service for both its price and especially its quality. And the reason is that Magellan TV is all about the drama of real life. The lives of ancient pharaohs, critical battles in World War I and II, soldiers who fought in the Civil War, the battles for control of the British Crown, the Norman Conquest. Join us in the series History's Verdict, whose first episode looks at how socialism in one's country was built by the man of steel, Joseph Stalin. Magellan TV has the largest and best collection of history shows anywhere, and since Magellan TV has membership gift cards available, they make the perfect gift as we get closer to the holiday season. That means I already have the Office Secret Santa sorted out thanks to Magellan TV. Not only are there no ads ever, but your subscription always includes 4K. Click the link in the description and join us today. A quick look at any map will show you that Mexico is the backyard of the United States, a Cold War superpower, and as a result, they found themselves staring down the barrel of the Truman Doctrine. This fundamental US principle of the Cold War mandated that the United States was to, quote, protect democracies from authoritarian regimes, which in practice meant suppressing left-wing insurgencies across the world in order to stop the spread of communist influence. Initially, Mexico's right-wing oligarchy had little issue with this setup, and the US had little reason to worry about its southern neighbor. However, this arrangement would soon break down, and the US-Mexican alliance found itself fighting guerrillas on the very doorstep of the capitalist world. Seen as posing an existential threat to both Mexico and the United States, the war that emerged resulted in the perpetration of what amounted to crimes against humanity, with effects that last to this day. So this story really begins in the late 1960s. By this time, Mexico had been under the control of the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the Industrial Revolutionary Party, or PRI, for decades. The PRI operated a one-party state, controlling all state governments as well as the Senate. Despite Mexico technically having democratic institutions, the PRI controlled all of them, including the presidency. This, of course, was made possible by massive electoral fraud. But their total control of the executive, legislative, and judicial branches of government opened the door to abuses of power and eventually to the persecution of the Mexican people. The PRI's initial base was made up primarily from the industrial urban class and trade unions, and even though their early decades in power were accompanied by economic growth, Mexicans living in more rural areas, and especially farmers, often found themselves at the short end of the economic stick. By the latter half of the 20th century, urban workers had also begun to turn away from the PRI as poor labor conditions, magnified by an inability to negotiate for better ones, formed cracks in their previous loyalty. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, waves of student and labor movements had been met with a solid wall of repression and backlash. The right-leaning PRI, fervently anti-communist, punished any dissident harshly. But in 1959, things began to change. That was the year that Cuba's dictator, Fulgencio Batista, fled the island country just ahead of Fidel Castro and his socialist movement, sparking an international situation that continued to spiral over the next decade. From Honduras to Venezuela, communist guerrilla movements took up arms against their governments, and their movements inspired some of those in Mexico to consider doing the same. Keep in mind that regions of Mexico already hosted rebel training camps, including those from which Castro had launched his own invasion of Cuba. These latent movements were met at the end of the 1960s by two massive student massacres at the hands of the Mexican government. The first took place on October 2, 1968, at a student rally being held in protest in Tlatelolco against the upcoming Summer Olympics being held in Mexico City. During the suppression of the protests, government snipers opened fire on the unarmed crowd. While the government claimed a death toll of 30, witnesses put the number closer to a more accurate 300. For many young people, this closed off the route of political activism and engagement, which they had tried and failed at over the preceding decades. Seeing no remaining options, they turned to armed resistance. As if this wasn't enough, a second massacre, known as El Halconazo, or the Corpus Christi Massacre, took place on June 10, 1971, when a government-trained paramilitary gang known as Los Halcones opened fire onto a student protest being held in Mexico City to voice anger over government interference in universities. 120 people died as a result. This second massacre brought to light the involvement of the United States, and especially the CIA, in Mexican affairs. Los Halcones had been trained by the Federal Security Directorate, a domestic defense agency established by the Mexican government with the help of the CIA in their pursuit of the Truman Doctrine. The FSD and their paramilitaries would later take charge of dealing with urban guerrilla fighters during the ensuing Dirty War, responsible for many bloody incidents against Mexican citizens in the process. The coalition that fought against the PRI was not a unified movement, but rather a collection of different groups, each operating under their own motivations, but facing a common opponent. The fighting took place in both urban and rural settings. In the countryside, Lucio Cabañas' Partido de los Pobres, the Party of the Poor, and Genaro Vázquez's Asociación Cívica Nacional Revolucionaria, the ANCR, or National Revolutionary Civic Association, led the fight. They were primarily centered in the southern Guerrero province, which would become a center of guerrilla fighting for years to come. Among the urban rebels, the most prominent group was the Liga Comunista 23 de Septiembre, or Communist League of September 23rd, the LC23S, whose operations covered multiple states. The number of guerrillas involved directly in these movements continued to be debated, with numbers ranging anywhere from 400 to 3,000 rebels in the Communist League alone. However, all of these groups, which numbered around 30 in total, were unified by their vision to see an economically, militarily, and politically reformed Mexico. Throughout the war, guerrillas would fight in small numbers, ambushing military or police outposts, patrols, and checkpoints before disappearing into their surroundings. Groups operating in urban areas would try to align their efforts to coincide with ongoing peaceful labor demonstrations taking place in the cities, while the guerrillas in more rural areas would stick to operating alone in the underpopulated mountain ranges of southern Mexico. These sides waged a two-front war, and although small in numbers, their impact was more than a nuisance to the government, who sought to crush them by means of ever-increasing force. In response to the growing unrest, the Mexican government responded with a campaign of bloodshed. This ranged from mass arrests, illegal detentions, and exile from the country, all the way to the complete destruction of towns, torture, and forced disappearances. To this day, the number of people disappeared by the PRI is unknown, as the party attempted to destroy all records of victims' existence, including birth and school certificates. When guerrillas were caught, they could be lynched or shot, and their bodies thrown into the ocean. The Dirty War derived its name from these acts, carried out against the rebels and even those that the PRI suspected of being their supporters. The government never acknowledged the rebels as soldiers fighting for a social movement. Instead, they were labeled as terrorists, gang members, criminals, or thugs. Through the conflict, Mexican propaganda continuously stated, quote, "There are no guerrillas in Mexico." Most of the fighting and subsequent repression centered around the southern province of Guerrero. Genaro Vázquez's ANCR had morphed from its roots as a teacher-led labor movement into an armed rebellion in the early 1970s. The movement had a solid base of support in Guerrero even before the beginning of hostilities, and the ANCR hoped to capitalize on this as a guerrilla war developed. However, on December 2, 1972, Vasquez died in a car crash outside Mexico City. His movement dispersed with his death, with many joining other rebel groups. The other rural leader, Lucio Cabañas, led his Poor People's Party to take up arms after a heavy government crackdown against striking miners in late 1967. He too would choose Guerrero as his base of operations, specifically sticking to the mountain ranges for protection while sending raiding forces out to combat the Mexican military. Cabañas was seen as the most prevalent threat to the PRI during the war. His group combined multiple kidnappings and robberies against government institutions with armed engagement against the Mexican military. A CIA report from late 1974 put his cadre at only 75 to 150 followers, but the actual number is most likely higher. Now, we should point out that Cabañas' actual threat to the Mexican government was quite limited. He wasn't interested in the mass action campaigns that had seen other revolutions succeed across the world. And despite this, his rebellion caused the army to deploy tens of thousands as part of their mission to stop him. The government response included the heavy repression and the elimination of any people suspected of supporting Cabañas. It would later be reported by Lucio's half-brother that 126 members of his extended family would be disappeared by the Mexican government in the years after 1967. Militarily, though, the Mexican army made little progress. The 4 battalions stationed in Guerrero grappled with low pay, few supplies, and old weapons. The rebels used hit-and-run tactics that drained army morale. Despite the launch of Operación Telaraña, Operation Spiderweb, with much fanfare in 1971, little to no progress against the rebels was made. The government also attempted a Hearts and Minds campaign, visibly displaying themselves, giving handouts to the local population, but with the bombings of rural communities by the army going on in the background, it was a hard sell. After several years of resisting Mexico City, Lucio Cabañas would die in a confrontation with the Mexican army in 1974, and like Vasquez, his movement died with him. In 1975, the United States launched Operation Condor, a state-sponsored terror campaign to repress left-wing activism across Latin America. Mexico was persuaded to join this bloody operation, although its actual involvement was limited. Despite this, the government's own goals and war crimes during the Dirty War fell in with the tactics of Condor, and thus the PRI received support from the US. We will deal more with Operation Condor in future episodes on Latin America, so we won't get into it here beyond saying that the Mexican government was happy to receive further funding and support from Los Americanos. As the Dirty War dragged on, the demands from the guerrillas slowly turned from their revolutionary ideas of reform to reactionary calls for the release of political prisoners and accountability for those responsible for the committing of war crimes. New movements emerged, still revolutionary, but they differed from their earlier counterparts regarding ideology. These new rebels were urbanites, whose ideas were less grounded in the grassroots and homegrown Mexican labor movement, and fell more in line with international socialism. Some drew inspiration from the Soviet Union, some from China, and some even from Cuba. These all came together to form a uniquely Mexican style of socialist revolutionary. Although their goals were even less defined than their predecessors and included fighting for the people and their culture to the dream of a truly democratic Mexico, they all held one thing in common: their stance against the PRI. The last of the significant guerrilla groups that posed any threat to the Mexican government was the previously mentioned Communist League of September 23rd. They had long abandoned their active struggle, and by the late 1970s were engulfed in a war for their very survival. Now, they operated in cells across Mexico. No one operative knew more than a few others, part of operational security. But this also meant that if some members left the movement or were captured, the entire system could collapse. They'd always worked closely with the political activist and student movements, which were commonly found in cities, and as the Mexican government increased its pressure, militancy became more unviable. Many members simply put down their weapons. So, what happened? Well, the war itself didn't go out with a bang, but rather with a drawn-out fizzle. When exactly the Dirty War even ended is a contentious matter in and of itself. A generally agreed upon date is 1982, but the specific reasoning for the date is elusive. Officially, Mexican counterinsurgency operations continued into the mid-1980s, but most rebel groups had likely dispersed before then. Overall aims that the guerrilla movements were fighting for were never achieved, and the PRI would continue to rule under a one-party state until 1988. This is the story of an obscure war, and like many events in the war, its consequences are rarely recognized. The Mexican government put rebel casualties between 1965 and 1975 at 600 dead. However, a report in November 2016 states that there were approximately 1,350 reported cases of disappeared individuals filed with the government since 1981, with 650 of those coming from Guerrero province alone. The Center for Historical Research on Armed Movements estimates the number of rebels killed in combat at 3,000. Reports of other crimes are scattered, but the Washington Post in 2006 counted over 2,141 reported cases of torture and 99 executions. To this day, there have not been any serious trials for members of the PRI regime who ordered these abuses, and cases that were filed have been subsequently dismissed. This is quite a wide discrepancy in numbers, but consider that it becomes very difficult to count the dead due to the special type of extrajudicial execution that was carried out by the Mexican army. Helicopter pilots were told to fly offshore while army officials disposed of packages. These turned out to be the dead bodies of teachers, activists, prisoners of war, and others who had been executed on the ground. These death flights, as they've become known, were almost never recorded, with all possible estimations of the number of dead coming from witness testimony. The unfortunate truth is that the very commissions established to investigate the crimes of the Dirty War are, to this day, obstructing the release of government records to the public. To some, the Dirty War never truly ended, and it was around the same time that the drug trade really began to establish itself in Mexico, and many point to the current human rights abuses and corruption on all sides of the war on drugs as beginning in this period. In the words of Santiago Aguirre, a Mexican lawyer and head of the PROD Center, which works with victims to file legal complaints to the government, quote, "The new context of drug violence has ended up diluting the idea that the disappeared are a thing of the past. Mexico needs extraordinary measures to face up to a human rights crisis that has its roots in the Dirty War and which has not ceased since then. There is no comparison on the continent." End quote. The legacy of the war itself was made to be forgotten, only recently becoming a focus for Mexican scholars. Yet it speaks to the influence of events such as the Cuban Revolution and other prominent guerrilla movements in Latin America. One inspired the next in a cycle of revolution, with the movements in Mexico spilling over to countries further south, including Guatemala. The tactics and strategies employed in Mexico's Dirty War were not isolated or unique. Similar strategies of torture and disappearance were seen in places like Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, among others, but there have been some attempts to tackle those abuses, however half-hearted. Mexico's Dirty War remains an underexplored subject, subsumed into the horrors of the war on drugs that followed. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel, but no matter what you do, do not let that bell button board the waiting helicopter, or it will never be seen again. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is the Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.